Welcome to the Heart of Soul podcast, an exploration of who you are, what you are, and why you are, offering new ways to investigate age-old questions at the heart of you. Hi, it's Joseph, and thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. It's been 4 months since we recorded, and we are forward. Thank you so much for your patience. Stace and I both were traveling at different times. I got COVID at one point. I'm still getting over that. And various other things got in the way, but we are forging onward and we'll be recording weekly like we were before. And it felt really great to record this one just a couple days ago. Not only did you have to wait 4 months for us to complete the series on sagehood that we began, and we will complete that, but we're pushing that off a week with an emergent topic brought to me via email that I thought would be good to address while the topic was hot. And that topic is a very old question. Believe me, as Donald Trump likes to say. Believe me, we've been asked this question. That was a terrible Trump impersonation. The topic is a very old question of how arrogant is it to say what we say and how we say it. We're well aware of how off-putting our conversations can be to some people, and this is what we have to say about it in terms of gold and green and motives and wounds and light side and shadow side, etc. In the end, I don't know. I'm just telling you how it looks to me, and Stace is saying how it looks to him. Be your own judge. That's what you do. Thanks for listening. Greetings and welcome forward. You've been so patient, listeners. Thank you. I almost forgot what I said at the beginning of the podcast while we were counting down the record button there. Welcome forward, Stace, and hi.
Hey.
Stace and I were just saying it seems like a lifetime since we did this, and I'm going to have to remember how to video edit, and Stace had to remember how to select speaker stuff on Zoom, but that's a somewhat perennial thing anyway for many people.
Yes.
So we interrupt this regularly scheduled series. We were down the road of sagehood, and we do plan to consider that, but there was an emergent email, and I have permission to thank Margie for that email by name, one of Bree's facilitants, who sent an email inquiring about some things and then added some constructive criticism that I admit hurt. It was more than just pinched, it hurt. And she said, I'm a big fan of the podcast, and you guys often sound arrogant, criticizing other paradigms, and I wish you'd talk more about the nature of identity and less criticism. I forget the other adjectives besides arrogant. There was at least one other. But it was great. It was, first of all, I so appreciate that, Margie. That took guts, and I hope this serves as a public service announcement that we love emails, and you can send... I almost said the most scathing criticism you have. Well, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't enjoy that, but I wouldn't stop you from sending it either. So send what you have. We subscribed as Edenists to when in doubt, roll it out and explore and relate. And so it ended up really good. And I wrote some things back to Margie just off the top of my head. And then I thought we'd explore the notion on the podcast. And because it's an old criticism, this is not new. You've been hearing this, I'm sure, for 40 years that you sound arrogant.
30 years
30
anyway.
Yeah. You're not old ugh for it to be. No, the paradigm is how old? What year do you put it on? When did the three circles hit you?
Well, the three circles hit me at 27.
Oh yeah, but then it took a while to start to flesh out what that was.
Yeah, the event didn't happen until 39.
Okay.
And then that's when I saw the emotional body, and everything started to fill in from there.
Seeing the emotional body, it seems like a good starting point. 39. That's like the first framework.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
So,
okay.
I have a lot to say on this subject, but I've already talked a lot. So one thing I want to say is Stace and I have not talked about the nature of arrogance and how we come off on this podcast. We've both been thinking about what we want to say about it, and I'm really curious if we end up agreeing. And so, what are your thoughts and feelings on this subject?
Oh, it's complex.
Yeah.
It's complex.
I agree with that.
I think I might be wrong here, but I think the other thing that Margie mentioned was, or maybe someone else said it, that we're kind of in a bubble when we get going sometimes.
Yeah.
Uh, I think that was the other framework on that. And there's lots of things to say about it. For me, a podcast is a really interesting animal because by nature, the interviewer and the interviewee are in kind of a bubble.
Yeah.
We know that it's going out into the world, and of course, even a psychologist would say we're not we're not responsible for how a person takes anything that we say as individuals and relationships, everything. But we need to be sensitive and respect it and see if there's any truth to it. So that's an interesting deal right there, because a podcast is not the same as a lecture, and so
Which is
that's
not
one
the
way.
same as a small group, which is not the same as one on
Yes,
one. So, like, yes,
exactly.
listeners, you're not here. So,
Yes,
we're trying to relate
yes,
to you. And that doesn't go very far in terms of
yeah,
relationality, right? Because we don't know who's
yes,
listening, how you're listening
right,
through it. It's radio, you know?
right.
So,
It's radio.
it's structurally less than fully relational.
Yes, and there's a really important point, because what's happening is Joseph and I, we only see each other. So we're necessarily in this smaller than universal relationality space. And so if you take that another step further, I can say that Joseph is the only person that I've ever met. I mean, he became awakened to it very, very quickly, but that he has the capacity for paradigmatic thinking. And interestingly enough, the ability to operate on paradigmatic thinking also affects how we inhabit our relationship to other paradigms. Uh,
Hmm.
and so I'd like to give an example of that. It's sort of a play off on one of the ones that you and I kind of
And
enjoy
before you, I want
sometimes.
to insert it's weird because it's like I could say I learned paradigmatic thinking from you, and that's true. But it's also true that lots of other people got just the same amount of exposure to it as I did
Yes,
and did not learn it.
yes. I think I just awakened it in
For
you. You have
sure.
it already.
So that
Yeah.
raises a lot of questions about like, well, what is it and where does it come from? And
Yes.
it's
Mhm.
part of why, on a personal level, something in each of us, dare I assert, relaxes, and it's like, oh, thank God, someone I can talk to from this corner
Yeah.
of who I am,
Yes.
and that's a personal
Exactly.
need that we're getting met that
Yeah.
we don't turn down in at all in these
Yeah.
podcasts, you know.
No.
Um,
No.
so that seems to be part of what we're doing and why we're here.
Yeah. And I'd like to give just a quick example, Joseph, about the different realities of different paradigms, because it goes right to the heart of the criticism that Margie's talking about of other paradigms. There's lots of dimensions to it.
Yeah.
Um, but here, let's just use a quick example. Let's say there's three Americans driving in Switzerland, in the hinterland of Switzerland, and one of them is a dairy farmer from Oklahoma, let's say. Another one is a scientist, a critical thinker,
Hmm.
more or less. And the other one is an American non-dual enlightened person. And so
Hmm.
they're driving in rural Switzerland, and they see a brown cow, one brown cow on the hillside. And right away, the dairy farmer says, "Wow, it's fascinating that the cows in Switzerland are brown." That's his way of experiencing this reality.
Okay.
The
Okay.
scientist says, "Well, that's a little narrow. Actually, all we're sure of is that there's at least one cow in Switzerland that's brown."
Hmm.
And and the non-dual teacher person says, "Well, that's still a little off here, because all we can say is that there's at least one cow in Switzerland, and at least one side of which is brown."
Nice.
Now, those are three different paradigms that are having the same experience and coming up with wildly different conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
So, depending on the paradigm of a listener, for example, if they're not paradigmatic thinkers by nature or by education, then they're going to have their own paradigm as a lens through which they experience the way we are in this. So it's a counterintuitive thing, Joseph, for me that paradigmatic thinking is actually part of the question here, part of the dimension of things
Oh,
here.
the challenge of whether one can think paradigmatically or not.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Now, that doesn't take away that we might have some stuff going on at all. It's just another complicating dimension to it,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And because Joseph and I are only experiencing each other, knowing secondhandly that's going out into the world, we have a friendship based on robust paradigmatic thinking, and we sometimes really enjoy our friendship of paradigmatic thinking. It's part of our friendship, and it can get exuberant with it. Again, not an excuse, not a deflection, just another
Well,
dimension.
yeah, and like I'm just remembering that time we were outside on your patio in Santa Barbara, and with Bree was there, and Elise was there, and we sort of you and I went down a paradigmatic thinking rabbit hole for just like 20 seconds, and both of them were like, I don't know what you guys are talking about, and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
remember that because I was like, really, this like, huh. I thought that was pretty easy to follow. So
Yes.
it's yeah, just because someone does X numbers of years of EBE and or is you
Mhm.
know, well along the way of emotional maturity doesn't mean that paradigmatic thinking comes in. And then that's where I want to share a bit of my shadow contribution to the arrogance that does come through, because arrogance is, I mean, this is psychology 101. It covers insecurity, among other
Right.
things. And
Mhm.
for me, the even though I didn't learn that I could think paradigmatically until my late 20s, it must have always been there somehow. And I think
Sure.
it was part of my childhood experience of everything seeming incredibly wrong, but I couldn't put my finger
Mhm.
on what it was. And
Mhm.
nobody gave me the vocabulary, which is a lot of what you did, gave me the
Right.
vocabulary. And other people say that too, like, oh, I already knew a lot of this, and now you're giving me the vocabulary to do it, vis-a-vis
Yes,
paradigmatic
exactly.
thinking. Because you can
Yeah.
study philosophy for 10 years, like in universities, and not learn that, which shocks me to this
That's
day.
it, to me also. To me
Yeah, because
also.
it's you're learning content, not the context of how to philosophize or what metaphysics really
Yes.
are.
Yes, that's right.
But it's I don't, I'm not feeling it today because I woke up in a very spacious place, but there are other days where it's gnawing on my soul, the claustrophobia of the lack of paradigmatic thinking. For example, one of the things that's been really bothering me with the Trump versus Biden slash Harris thing is this whole thing about democracy dies in darkness and we have to save democracy. I want democracy dead. Democracy doesn't work. And Socrates and Plato knew this over
Yes.
2,400 years ago, 100 years
Yes.
into Athenian democracy. And
Yes.
that it was a pendulum swing too far from tyranny. And I
Yes.
Googled this, interestingly, short sidebar here, because I think this is relevant to current events and
I,
whatnot.
I, I can sense where you're going. So go ahead. Yeah, this is great.
A lot of people think that democracy was founded by people like the philosopher would-be kings and queens like Aristotle and Plato and whatnot. They were never pro-democracy. Democracy came from a guy named Cleisthenes, who in around 500 BC, he and this other guy overthrew a tyrant, and then Cleisthenes was ostracized by the other guy, something with a P, I
Uh-huh.
forget his name. They were both vying for power, and like this is a old story, right? Overthrow of a tyranny, and then the new
Hmm.
tyrant wants to show up, and he exiles and he threats. So Cleisthenes was exiled, and then sometime later, a new guy show up, or the person who exiled him was taken out of power, and all the exiles got to come back to Athens. And then Cleisthenes, who was seen as a good guy who got rid of the bad guy, was like, oh, well, maybe you can help rebuild the government. And he came up with democracy, I'm sure with the help of some other people. So right away we would go, this guy was exiled and really tormented by a tyrant. Maybe he would want to err on the side of making sure that would never happen again.
Sure.
So he built a government based on the people having the power so that there could never be a tyrant again. And people like Plato and Socrates 100 years later were like, we get the idea here, but what's going to happen is because intelligence is not evenly distributed, you're going to have persuasive, charismatic demagogues who will sway the masses to vote not in the interest of the whole or even in the interest of themselves. And it will become a personality contest. I wonder if that could ever happen in a democracy.
Gee, it certainly describes one side of the spectrum here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautifully taken. I get what you're saying here.
This is the meta for why democracy is having all of these problems. It's better than tyranny, but it's easily understood as, we've had a lot of testing of it, and there's a lot of demagoguery and tyranny coming back into the system, and democracy is not a system that can handle it. It's not checked and balanced enough. And I don't know if we've talked about that ever in a podcast before, but we need a benevolent dictatorship. And I just wish, and here's one of the things where I start to feel the anger in me, is like, why the fuck doesn't a group of powerful and intelligent people hire Stace and I to design a new government? Because we could do it.
We could
do it.
Without ego.
Yeah.
We could
do it because it takes paradigmatic thinking, and it takes coherent models, and it takes honesty, and it takes maturity. And there's no criteria for maturity. Identity has a criteria for maturity. And that would be one of the things to start with. So then the last thing I want to say, and then I'll shut up and let you talk, is so maybe I just want to make sure I don't skip over before I start tirading. It hurts me. It hurts me that the world is this dim. It hurts me that people compete based on intelligence when it's so obvious and observable that intelligence and awareness and emotional maturity or maturity of any kind are not evenly distributed. Why do we pretend that they are and get offended if someone asserts that they know something that another person doesn't? When a plumber comes here and says, you need a new gasket on this faucet, I'm like, how dare you pretend that you know more about this than I do? I'm so hurt and offended. No, that's why I hired the person, right? But if
you hire them for their arrogant knowledge.
Well, you just say it like it's obvious, like, well, I don't see what you're talking about, right? But if you assert things like democracy doesn't work, and I could help with that, you ask 1,000 people if that's arrogant, and I think they would all agree, right?
Completely. Well, it's just what you just said. Why doesn't someone hire the two of us? Well, who the fuck do these guys think they are?
Exactly. So arrogance literally means an exaggerated sense of self-importance. So the question is really, how exaggerated is it? Because I really think we could design a new government. So if that's not an exaggeration and we could prove it, just like I've always wanted to design a law that makes lying illegal, and immediately you would say, well, that's really complicated. Give it to me. Give me the bill to write. I can do it.
Yes.
Because if you ever actually read real laws, they're terribly written. Yeah. That's why they get misinterpreted and tweaked and argued against and restated in places like the Supreme Court, where it's like, oh yeah, we're going to redefine what that meant 20 years ago. It's because it was badly written in the first place. And not everyone has that ability to metaphysically, paradigmatically, and philosophically think and write in a way that prevents misinterpretation. That's 1 in 10 million.
Oh, I love how you're framing this and energizing and emoting all three at the same time here, Joseph. Because you said something recently that really struck a chord for this whole discussion, and I want to bring it forward. And that is that it's very rare to find someone a low percentage of this planet thinks critically,
Yes.
having doubts about what they believe in, or whether their thinking is stinking thinking
Yeah.
or unsober. What's the percentage of people have even critical thinking? It's
Yeah.
rare.
And
It's rare.
if you don't know what a straw man argument is, if you don't know what petito principe means, if you don't know what correlation isn't causation means, if you don't know exactly what those means, you can't think critically. You can't.
Yes,
You don't know
exactly.
enough about it. And that's not your fault, because it's only
No.
taught mostly in law school, and I've even met lawyers who don't do it particularly well.
Yes, I could say I know a lawyer very intimately, and he doesn't know anything about
Well,
such
and
a
because
thing.
part of that is because emotional, undigested emotion, because we're emotional beings first, mental second, it will distort
Yes.
someone's ability to critically think, even if they have that skill and training. It can still screw up their critical thinking. But if you have critical thinking and have done a lot of emotional work, it cleans that up and it makes you a better thinker. And who has that combination? Legal level critical thinking training and decades of emotional work. That's rare.
Yeah. And right to the heart of democracy. This is such a ripe
Totally right.
adjunct
Uh-huh.
to our where we want, where I feel like we can go to and expand it even further, is that if I'm on trial for murder,
Peers,
and
right?
and
Mm-hmm.
and I have 12 peers. Well, we all have a beating heart. We all breathe. We need to eat. We need to defecate. We need to urinate. We are peers in that way. But when someone is evaluating a crime or a motive, when it gets really
Sure.
sticky, a motive, out of the jury pool in a democracy, which is only in America, where they've got 12 people off the street
Who couldn't figure out how to
do
get out
this,
of jury duty, as the joke goes.
as it goes. But I want someone in there, first of all, who's got critical thinking, which is 5 out of 100 at the current level, or 10 out of 100. 10% of people are critical thinkers, meaning having doubt or question about how they think and what they think. Both,
Yes,
not
and the
just
other
what they think,
95 think they're critical
right?
thinkers.
And they're not, right?
See Dunning-Kruger effect. I won't go into it.
Oh,
Google Dunning-Kruger effect. The incompetent people overestimate their incompetence. Competent people tend to underestimate their incompetence.
yeah. Oh, that's a great. I haven't heard it put that way. But for example, as you cited here, MAGA people are not critical thinkers.
Not
They don't
usually.
critical think. They're not usually, because they're either too informed by their Christian attachment, which doesn't allow critical thinking, only belief.
Yes.
Secondly, if you had critical thinking, it would take you maybe a year to really see through Trump's facade of what he really is. Where it would, if you had a paradigmatic thinker look at Trump, it would take 5 seconds to see what this man is actually made of, and has no sense of the common good, only his own.
Yeah.
So,
I was thinking, it's just so funny. I was arguing in my head, prepping for this podcast in some ways I was thinking about the jury thing yesterday that came into my head. Maybe at the same time you were thinking, I don't know. But I
yeah,
was
yeah,
imagining, like, if I were ever on trial for something, I was imagining the argument I would make to dismiss members of the jury and contesting that very point. And I imagine this argument of
yeah.
like,
Oh,
so
nice.
could a 10-year-old be on this jury? And the answer would be no, because they're not a peer. Okay, well, why is a 10-year-old not my peer? Right? And then they
Uh-huh.
would have a list of things.
Oh,
And
oh,
then
good
you can
call.
easily apply that. What? Because they can't critically think? What? Because they don't have the same kind of experiences I've had? So you're
Yeah,
saying just because the person is biologically mature, then we're peers?
yeah.
Obviously not,
Oh,
right?
nice.
Do they have a
Yeah,
4-year
yeah.
degree? Have they ever been self-employed? What kinds of relationships have they been in? Are they operating in a paradigm that's 2,000 years old and is desperately in need of updating? That's a little less
Yes.
objective, of
Oh,
course, but
sure. Well, and what we're talking about right now is the application of identity's spiritual principles
mm,
here, uh, into the human domain, right? Because we're all children of divine being, and the only place I can say from the heart of my soul that where I'm peer with every single human being is that we're all children of divine being.
Mm-hmm.
That we're peers in. But once you start applying that to the human condition, where self-reflection requires sobriety to be able to trust your perception of someone else's reality.
Yeah.
You see, so this is really complicated stuff, and arrogance is a strong word, as you say. It's an overamping of something that comes out of an insecure base. So what we're trying to say here is, I have to say this too. I've got a whole chapter in "We Feel, Therefore We Are," where in the last 5 pages I give an outline to reinvent. Get that tyranny is not the opposite of democracy.
Yeah, nice.
Enlightened leadership, enlightened statesmanship is the opposite of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Like in Europe, the experts decide. There's three people sitting in a trial, and the expert legal minds decide if the person is guilty or not guilty, not peers. They've got it better wired up in Europe that way. France, Germany, Switzerland. So in that sense, what we're talking about here, there's even further complication.
Oh, we're just getting started. Keep going.
Another dimension. Running down other paradigms, and I want to speak to this completely honestly. When you experience over a whole lifetime working with people, the utter damage that other paradigms do to the heart and soul of human beings, East and Western religions damage the soul. And when you work personally with people who are trying to heal from the incredible things that Catholicism puts into people, it's hard not to be frustrated, angry, and judgmental. Are those things unspiritual when the motive for the criticism is because you have direct experience of hundreds of people, in my case, a couple hundred people over my 35 or 40 years who have suffered terribly from the effects of religion? Is it arrogance to criticize that when the motive is the pain that I've had to help people with to heal from that? Another complicating dimension. So in that sense, I can take it from anyone, Marge included. Thanks, Margie. I can take it because there's always some truth somewhere. But what's the overwhelming? What's the bigger picture thing here? If a critical thinker says I'm being arrogant and judging other paradigms, that's interesting. Tell me more. If a paradigmatic thinker does that, I would say you're not a paradigmatic thinker, because a paradigmatic thinker gets the sobriety index of different paradigms. And when the sobriety index of a certain paradigm damages people, is it arrogant to criticize those? You see what I'm saying? Another complication.
Yeah, for sure, because there's between democracy and subjectivism, going all the way back to Descartes, and sociology and anthropology, all of those systems have delivered us to this sort of implicit a priori, we should accept everything as equal, leading up to the benchmark of the Democratic Party promoting equity of outcome, not just equality of opportunity.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is fucked. That's the death of meritocracy. And that will lead to bad things, and it's observable that it's the case. And there's a whole party that is behind that. So there's this sort of thing where, it's like when a plumber is working on my faucet and they go, oh, whoever installed this faucet, they used the gasket that came with the faucet instead of using plumber's putty. And plumber's putty is the better way to do it. I don't go, well, I installed that faucet, and you're offending me and the paradigm of the manufacturer who insists that this it's just a different way of looking at it. And we can evaluate whether it's better or worse based on how it functions. And we do that with all sorts of stuff, but not people's politics or religions, because that's too close to home with their values, because their values are distorted, and those distorted values is the shield around their wounds that are being purposely but unconsciously hidden.
Yes.
There was something else I wanted to say as well about that, but I can't remember.
It'll come. I'm sure. With all,
go ahead.
With all these dimensions to the question, there's no easy answer to find a 100% accurate diagnosis of the charge of being arrogant. And so what we've got to do, though, is even from anyone, I won't take seriously a charge of arrogance from a non-critical thinker, a MAGA person, for example. I'll take it semi-seriously from a critical thinker. I'll take it very seriously from a paradigmatic thinker, because that person is seeing through all sorts of stuff that even critical thinkers don't do, like you said. But having said all that, there's one other personal, and this will lead to where I can acknowledge some truth to what Margie's saying, is that I had to be way over-identified with the paradigm of identity to ever get it out there into the world. I had to, everyone I talked to thought I was crazy. No one understood how saying emotion is the root dynamic of human consciousness changes everything. It's so new. We've used this argument before. It's as big in this field of emoto spirituality as seeing the earth, the sun is the center of the solar system.
And there's a great example.
The earth.
If you think that's arrogant, you don't understand the implications of it, because it does change everything, and that's demonstrable. Just intellectually demonstrable. You don't have to experience it. Just like heliocentrism versus, what's the other one? Earth-centrism. What I forget that word. Geocentrism. Just like that, if you don't understand how that changed all of astronomy, then you don't know shit about astronomy, right? But it did, because it does, right? And we could say something for a minute or two about astronomy, and then you go, oh yeah, that does change everything.
But people don't, that's not a living truth for them in everyday life, right? Yeah. So it's interesting, because I was racking my brain. Has any certified therapist, based on diagnosing and treating mental issues, have they ever really finished the deep ends of EBE? And I can't think of any. And so this is not a criticism of any psychologist or therapist.
Someone who starts out as a therapist and then does EBE. No, everyone I've ever known stops at a certain point.
They do, because and the charge is, you think you know better than Freud and all the boys and girls, Anna Freud included. You think you know better than that? Yeah.
Well, they all thought they knew better than neurologists, didn't they?
Right, exactly.
And Jesus thought he knew better than so-and-so, and the Buddha thought he knew better than Hindus, and Muhammad thought he knew better than the polytheists, and MLK thought he knew better than the racists. There's no such thing in our world as a pioneer of any kind of sociological or psychological or philosophical or religious anything who doesn't say, I think you're wrong.
Yes.
They don't just sit there and say, well, I've got this other idea. They have to compare and contrast it.
And that's why I spoke, when you're introducing an entirely new paradigm, you have to contrast it with what's out there to get people unstuck from the paradigm that they don't know they're slaves to.
No, that's the key thing. Yeah, because people can't think paradigmatically, they don't actually know the paradigms that are influencing their day-to-day behaviors.
And values.
Yes.
Especially values.
So part of what we're doing here, and I just do this, I know you do too, it's just part of who we are. You're a walking around illuminator of paradigms. So like when someone I mean, oh my God, I knew there were some people in my life who 4 years ago, when I would say something, they'd be like, your thoughts are spells, right? You've heard this new age stuff.
Oh, yes.
And so, I would express a negative thing or something, or some cynical kind of thing. And they'd be like, well, don't think like that. Your thoughts are spells. What am I supposed to do with that? Right? Because like, they have a good intention and they're trying to help me.
Right.
But what they're actually doing is imposing what looks to me as a very stupid paradigm. That's a little harsh. A limited paradigm that I played with and moved past and tested. And they don't even realize it's a paradigm. They don't know where that comes from. They don't know the exact distortions of Buddhism that produced it. And so I could try to explain that to them in the moment. They won't get it. And now I'm in a teacher mode with them, and that's not appropriate. So what do I say? No. Thanks, I'll think about that. It's really aggravating and confusing.
It is. I'll come back to psychologists in a moment and their paradigm. Mm-hmm. But I was once, I gave a talk and there was it was on parenting. And there were many parents in a little seminar. And I opened up the seminar, this was before I met you, and asked each of the parents there who came for a little an illumination, what's your paradigm of parenting? And there were like 8 or 9 people, and 8 or 9 of the 7 or 8, 90% of the small group, 80% said I don't have a parenting paradigm. And I said, well, then why are you here? What are you here to question? You see? Geez. And so one person said, well, I have a parenting paradigm, and that is give all the love I have to my kids. And I said, okay, how do you distinguish healthy love from toxic love? Well, there's no such thing as toxic love.
Whoops.
And so here, my own example of exactly what you're saying here. Yeah. What do you do in that? A basis for identity, the foundational basis is there's no shortage of love in our world. What there's a shortage of is a emotively mature love. And if that one element of identity was grokked, felt, and realized by people, they would change their paradigm. It would open up doors where they could change their paradigms. Same principle with a therapist. Their paradigm that they learn with, which gives them lots of insight into unconscious motives and blah, blah, blah. And they encounter identity, they may hear that emotion is our picture that changes everything, emotion first, not mind or energy. They're going to interpret our paradigmatic criticisms as possibly arrogant. Mm-hmm. When they hear the truth, oh yeah, that calls me there, but they haven't felt the truth of it. What it means to be emotionally first.
I just got something about that. So if you're not aware of the paradigm that you're currently living, which is 99.99% of people,
including therapists.
Yes, especially therapists, very often.
Especially therapists. Yeah.
If you're not aware of your paradigm, then when you encounter information or ideas that are counter to your paradigm, right, you can't objectively, which is always in quotes, but you can't reasonably compare the two. You can only get offended.
Yes, that's right.
You can only get pissed off.
You can only get offended
because the emotional based or energetic / emotional based protector is guarding that paradigm. So when someone says, I don't have a paradigm about parenting, yeah, you do. It's just unconscious because you can't not have a paradigm, and that's demonstrable because you've asked the person 20 questions and they answer them. You can just tell them, here's your paradigm. You got this from Christianity. You got this from American democracy. You got this from John Locke. You got this from Dr. Spock, and you cobbled it together and made a paradigm.
Or this one from Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, that's possible.
Horton Hears a Who. Right. Horton Hears a Who.
So people have paradigms, but if they're not aware that they are, and then you subject them to very clear paradigmatic information, it pisses their protector off, whose intention is to make sure the essential person, never sees their paradigm. Because if you actually shine light on someone's paradigm, and really explicate it all the way out, the absurdity of it becomes clear. And the gold aspect, the soul aspect of someone would see that, and then so would the protector, and there'd be this battle of like, but this is who I am, and you're trying to show me that it's got internal contradictions in it, like the famous George Carlin questions, like can God create a rock so big he can't lift it, or one question I got from you, I think I got this from you, is like, how did Jesus die for our sins in advance before I made the sin? How does that work? These kinds of questions shine lights on the lack of logic, and you can do it in seconds. Like in Buddhism, I got this from you also. If Buddhism is about going with the flow, then and the Buddha was a revolutionary who received death threats from speaking out against Hinduism, how does that go together? So to quote you, if the Buddha had been a Buddhist, there would be no Buddhism.
Yes.
QED, paradigm exploded.
Present kind of Buddhism. Yes, exactly.
And that's very offensive to people's protection mechanism. So what do you do with that? Not offend them? Yeah. Not present that to them?
Right.
And but before I forget, I do want to say one thing I'm working on that Eric Grace helped me with just a few days ago. Helped me get that back to the wound contribution, because I want to make sure I own as much as I can about that. I am noticing that because of the paradigmatic thinking angst in me, I can see the ways in which I lead with that instead of actual relationality. Because if someone says something like your thoughts are spells, the thing to do in that moment, relationality-wise, would be to report the feeling.
Yes.
Not like, you idiot, that's a bunch of shit. I'm not saying that I said that, but whatever I did say probably had some flavors of that. And that's not real relationality. So for me, there's an order thing of love first, wisdom second. And the wisdom that you and I both have is that paradigmatic thinking. So I'm working on putting that behind the relationality thing. And I think that turns down the perception of arrogance.
It changes the bandwidth with which we deliver our whatever, and so that's exactly where I'm going to, Joseph.
How about that?
Is that what I want to say? Just because therapists have a paradigm that they not really aware of much of, based on energy, mind, and body, not emotion.
Right.
That doesn't mean they can't see through or feel stuff that might be off my radar screen. So to complete what I started before, I had to be over-identified with identity to get it out into the world against, 10,000 years of paradigmatic slush. And so that required me to repress any insecurities I had, because I knew with my spiritual access that what I was getting out there, not trying to sell it, but to tell it. I always just wanted to tell it. I never tried to sell it because I knew what I was up against. For people to start out, pioneers have to be egoists up to a certain point. They just have to be. You gave me a great metaphor for some of my early bombasticism. Well, the consciousness dirt of Earth was so hardened, you had to have you had to jam that shovel in to make a furrow for a new one, and that's a real truth. And so, what I want to say to Margie and any other person who is makes a claim of arrogance, I can tell you that I am 40 to 50% less over-identified with the paradigm than I was 10 years ago. And I'll be working on that, because the over-identification is based on being someone who felt invisible, a kid who had gifts that no one else had, inborn, innate, didn't have to learn them. I was in a bubble of solo reality so long, I didn't have a clue about what it meant to relate to human beings. And so as I've been gradually healing it, and it's been going an extra velocity and depth the last 2 years, I'll be working on, since no one's ever done with their shadow, ever, it's impossible. It's a Zeno's paradox thing. You never finish. All I can do is say that what you sensed there, Margie, probably was an insecurity in me that had to get submerged so I could get the paradigm out there.
Mm.
And I've had the realization given to me by other really wonderful people that why are you still running downhill? The paradigm is out there now. You don't have to hold it so tight. And
Mm.
so it's not about holding. It's a personal. It's not the holding of the paradigm is not the issue too tight. The too tightness is my own insecurity of non-relationality with human beings because I could never find anyone who saw things like I do. You're the first paradigmatically, metaphysically.
Mm.
Eric's got a big piece of that too.
Mm.
But I've got stuff. And so when you combine my stuff of still learning, I'll have to compensate with what might look like arrogance. And I can understand why it would be seen as arrogance, but I can't really understand how it would be felt as arrogance. But who am I to say? That's up to the
Yeah.
person to look at that,
And
right?
yeah, I want to say a couple of things. This paradigmatic paradigmatic thinking, it's almost like it's a misnomer in some ways, because for me anyway, and I think it's the case for you, otherwise you would not have written all the books that you've written, it has its own kind of aliveness to it. Like,
Yes.
it's not something, it's like, I think I'll think paradigmatically for a half an hour now. It wakes me up in the middle of the night. Like that victimhood
Yes.
poem I read a while ago.
Yes.
Like
Oh God. Yes. Oh yeah.
the paradigmatic, it's like a soul level. In Howard Gardner, I think is his name, who came up with like the 12 kinds or 9 kinds of intelligence, called it existential intelligence, which I don't love as a term, but it is that big. It's a way
Yeah.
of processing reality, and it has a mind of its own. So
Yes.
it's like it's a way of being. It feels like it's like a creative instinct in me. It just goes, and so it's hard
Yeah.
not to get caught up in it. And my own over identification in digesting Margie's wonderful email, it reminded me of how these were the 80 days in the 1980s where Trivial Pursuit was this famous game that everybody was playing.
Oh yeah.
And my father was really good at it. And I was probably, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 when I started to be old enough to hear and understand what it meant. Dad knows everything because he was really good at it. Dad knows everything. He does the hardest crossword puzzles, and he's read all the books, and he went to Cornell, and it was like Dad knows everything. So just one, that frame, intelligence was literally Trivial Pursuit skill, right? Which is not fucking intelligence, right? It's not even, it's not
No.
critical thinking. So, and he's
No.
not a particularly good critical thinker. So
Right.
I learned from my father, which if you listen to the appropriate episodes, I later learned was not my father. So I learned from this
Yes.
person that I could sense was not my father, that a man meant being intelligent, and intelligence meant knowing stuff, which went directly against, one, that I wasn't related to the guy, and two, that's not where my mental gifts were.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be until my late 20s that I started to actually get that. So I didn't realize how tortured I was just by this far away guy who knew lots of stuff but didn't see me, didn't see my intelligence. He was a math major. I was terrible at math. It's one of my worst things. So he didn't see me as intelligent.
Yeah.
And so I had to become this self-made high school student, and I was a good high school
Yeah.
student, but I got my ass kicked in college because it was way harder. And again, nobody there saw my gifts either. So all of this is part of my axe to grind, because I still feel invisible in a world where this kind of paradigmatic thinking, again, not only is it not seen, but its nephew, critical thinking, isn't even fully seen.
Nephews and good. That's great. I get that. Yeah.
So it's a
Oh.
perpetual source of angst, and that it leads me to this question that I suggested my email with Margie. Would 100% gold, purely healthy human being come off?
Possible.
Yeah, which we don't think is possible, but who knows? Theoretically, would such a person come off as arrogant at all? Well, we have to allow for that. The person perceiving them could make them seem arrogant, right? Because that's part
Yes.
of the equation.
That's that's their filter value system,
Yes, if
right?
they feel challenged or feel less than, if they have undigested shame, that is,
Right.
like I was saying before, challenging their cobbled together values and
Right.
unquestioned assumptions. Calling someone arrogant becomes a justification for not actually having to listen.
Yes.
And then I think of someone like Adyashanti, who I
Yes.
was a big fan of and still respect his work hugely. He's drafting off of universal bandwidths so as not to
Yes.
come across as personally opinionated.
Yes.
And like I said to Margie, you and I could do that.
Yes.
We could, maybe we should. Turns my stomach to think about doing that. But we could show up in saint
Uh-huh.
and sagehood infused bandwidths and come from a universal place appealing to universality in people, and do a presentation of something that is not offensive and very inclusive, and
Mhm.
would invite people in and not put off any kind of arrogance. Well, maybe subtly, if you knew how to listen to it. I mean, I think just departing your humanity and coming from that place is arrogant, right?
Oh God, yes,
Adi
it is.
Da, well, he was arrogant
Yeah.
anyway. But I mean, there is a kind of
Yeah.
arrogance if you listen in Adyashanti, because he's not down in the human experience with people. It's
Yes.
sort of meta arrogance in a way. But then if we were to do that, is that authentic to
Yeah.
temporarily leave the personhood domain behind? It doesn't feel like it to me.
No, and it means you also have a strategic agenda.
Right. What would be the
It's
motive
not
for
it's
doing
not
that? So
right.
that people think
You
we're
see it,
perfectly here. We could sell more books and services, right?
and I refuse to. I have refused all this time and still do metaphysically, not in its application. We're all still learning about its application,
Mhm.
and maybe if people listen to all the podcasts, they would hear us agonize over how we don't like criticizing. But when you're paradigmatic thinking, it just falls out.
Yeah.
But if you're drafting off of universality, not connected to the human condition, that's a paradigm in itself.
Uh-huh.
You see, and so we wouldn't soften the metaphysical assumptions and offerings of identity to sell it. We wouldn't. That's why I'm still alive, to make sure that
Mhm.
that is held by those who really resonate with the paradigm. Don't try to sell it, just tell it, share it, and see who comes. We don't. So in that sense, I'll have, for Margie specifically, I'll have stuff for the rest of my life to work on in this domain of human relationality. And I'm so happy to have found a doorway to actually have a productive beginning to it.
Mhm.
So, am I going to come off arrogant sometimes by compensating because I'm still too over-identified with what the truth is or the wisdom of identity as opposed to its heartful application? I might. I might. So I beg forgiveness that way, in some sense, because I'm going to be forever imperfect. But you can use "I'm forever imperfect" as a way to not take yourself to task,
Sure.
also.
Yeah.
So please, I love that we have this topic up because even people in identity don't like to listen to the podcast
It's true.
be,
It's true.
because it's blah 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 to something that they feel,
Yeah.
and that's okay. But to teach it or educate people, you've got to have the metaphysical framework somewhere in your consciousness in the front. At the same time, you're trying to balance it with heartful soulfulness.
Yeah.
Because if you can't be an educator otherwise, and if you don't have that metaphysical framework at the front of at least equal to your heartfulness and soulfulness, it gives room for the protector to use what we call truths in service. And that's not sober. And Edenists do this all the time as we're all working through our what we call our green. So, oh, what a complex mess.
Yeah, it is. I just saw, when you were just in the last 10 seconds there, I saw an image of the mind and the heart as two. My cat is trying to get on the desk and she sits on the Ethernet cable and messes my internet up. I just saw an image of the mind and the heart as checking and balancing each other, like two branches of a government. Because
nice.
if the heart can feel stuff, but it's not 100% right. And sometimes there'll be a feeling that gets distorted that paradigmatic thinking can go, uh-oh, there's an alarm there, and vice versa.
Yeah, and vice versa.
And there's other faculties as well. There's intuition, and there's lots of different things. We want to use all the senses, and that's why I'm a huge proponent of paradigmatic thinking. It's one of the books I want to write. It's just about paradigmatic thinking, and to try to be a vehicle to educate people. But how much of that is coming from my own wounding that my parents didn't see that gift in me? Well, I've done like 50.
It's always going to color. It's going to flavor it.
Yeah, I've done 15 years of EBE or so, and I'm still a zealot about paradigmatic thinking. That could change tomorrow, but I still get animated about how important it is. And like you said before, if you don't think it's important, then maybe you haven't seen someone who has like a energetic concrete wall between their third and fourth chakra that's splitting them in two, or you don't see someone who's escaping reality out the top of their seventh, or you haven't felt the shame that was put into someone by a priest or their years of Sunday school. Because when you really, like you said, when you really get a taste of that, that will elicit real anger, and conviction and passion is related to that, because it does really damage people.
And if what we're saying here, which colors so many different dimensions, that was beautiful, Joseph. Thank you. New pioneers who bring new paradigms in, like the Buddha, like Yeshua, who was Yeshua against Judaism, the Buddha against Hinduism. These pioneers weren't actually paradigm thinkers.
Yeah.
They just sensed that something was greater in truth and application to humano-spiritual reality than Judaism or Hinduism, okay? But they themselves weren't meta to their pioneering paradigmatic introduction. And so I was thinking about this since we decided to do the podcast, because from what I know, and you have a far better grasp of what's out there these days than I do, but we're the first paradigm to offer the nature, quality, and depth of paradigmatic thinking. Mm-hmm. It's not even in philosophy. So much of philosophy is bubbled off into content categories. No one's minding which content category is closer to reality.
Well, because they're not trying to live it anymore.
No,
they're just thinking about
philosophy it. Philosophy is all up here, right? Yeah, and so there's a structural limit to philosophy in the first place. But when you start with emoto soulful primariness to consciousness, human consciousness, everything changes. So will we have stuff in our exuberance? Will two friends who are, I told Bree the other day when this came out, Joseph and I, we're like, in one way, two teenagers who found each other in senior and high school and go, fuck, you see things like I do? Oh, holy shit. And we get a little exuberant. But at the core of it, if you listen to all 95 or 6 podcasts, you'll know that in the deeper background, even though we can, from our unhealed stuff, still be a little acerbic.
Acerbic, that's a great
word. It's all based in compassion and sorrow. That sometimes my sorrow is so big, I can't bear it about the state of the world. And so some of my wounds will come forward and say something a little too edgy.
Yeah, and like when I'm working one-on-one with someone and encountering the paradigms that have been inculcated into them and the damage, that's when the job requires compassion and sorrow and resempathy and relating. I can't go, that fucking stupid paradigm, why, how could people think that way? You can't do that in those moments. This is the place where I get to do that. And I think that's a reasonable human need, because I'm not singling out anyone or blaming them. And I'm not blaming anyone for not being able to paradigmatically think, because nobody taught you.
No.
So that's another, I didn't even realize that there's a back pressure in me because you have to be still with someone and respect that their parents were doing the best they could, that they took it in and did the best they could. That's where you got to come from a universal and then personal place. This is a place where we get to just carve it up into pieces with a Ginsu knife, and I want to do that too.
Yes. And this is not a counseling session. This webcast, podcast. So in that sense, here's a good example. Another good example. I was working with a world-renowned therapist, Harvard trained in voice dialogue. Harvard trained, very well-known worldwide expert at the time. And in his work, it uncovered some unconscious conflicts between he and his wife, and the realization that they might have a shelf life to the relationship was really threatening to both of them. And I was with him more than her, and we were talking about paradigms. We got to paradigms, voice dialogue paradigm versus identity's paradigm of personal work, right? And he said, well, so I said, well, you have another spiritual paradigm in addition to your voice dialogue. Oh, yes, I have my Swami Guru. And, but I was thinking the other day, this is him talking, if my guru said to leave my marriage, I would do it in a nanosecond.
Whoa.
But if EBE, at that time Esh, tells me it's probably a rabid toxic codependence, I wouldn't leave it.
Wow.
Now, this was as clear a distinction of paradigmatic impasse. And I said, and you feel that sober, that you do it just because the guru is all knowing. If he told me, he must know this. But if I learn that it is through your process, I won't necessarily follow it. Now, what is that about? I bring that in because in that context, just like you just said, I was heartful enough to say, I don't know what to do with that. You have to decide.
Yeah.
You have to decide what to do with that. I'm not trying to sell our way of looking at things as better than voice dialogue or than what your guru says.
That's the relational response. Yeah.
Right. And he said, well, that's generous of you. And so, and there was a tweak right in that statement. Like, wait, you don't get what I'm saying, but I let it go. And I never heard from him after that session. So it's this whole idea of, well, look at one of the famous films from the 50s, Rashomon.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
That so clearly saw seven different or whatever bystanders saw the same action and had their paradigms imparted them 7 different explanations for what was happening. So as long as we're all saying we all have gifts to share with each other, one day we can heartfully and soulfully at least agree to disagree with heart, and that's okay too.
It hit me.
But agree to disagree's got problems in it too.
Yeah, it does. Well,
it
sort of relates to what I was just going to say that hit me while you were talking there is because people mostly can't think paradigmatically when they're exposed to paradigmatic thinking or identity. They frame it as you think you know more than I do, or you think your paradigm is better than mine. But that's outside of the realm of paradigmatic thinking. Yes. Paradigmatic thinking would not say that one paradigm is better or worse. But because they can't do it, that's the frame they have for it. Paradigmatic thinking would say
better
or worse, I'm better and you're worse, or I'm smart and you're dumb. That's not what's going on. Paradigmatic thinking would say identity explains more and is a more comprehensive model than another model. Right. And you could take a look and compare and experience that for yourself.
Sure.
But as soon as you go, you think you know something that I don't, you're outside of paradigmatic thinking, and it just knocked on the door and you said, go away.
Yes.
Instead of who is it?
Yeah.
And because that's the paradox of paradigmatic thinking is in one way you have to be able to think paradigmatically in order to learn it. A little bit.
No,
I
you
never
gotta have
thought
the
of that.
capacity for it. You're
Some
right.
part of me
Joseph.
got
You're
really
exactly right.
I felt a lot of despair in that moment. It was like, oh, that explains some shit. I didn't think of that before. You have to be able
Yeah.
to think in terms of models. Sometimes when I'm talking about this kind of stuff with people, when they say, well, like, I don't agree with this part of identity, like, okay, well, why not? And they don't have anything after that.
Yeah.
Then I would say, like, at some point in those conversations, I'll say something like, well, it's like you're agreeing with helium, but not hydrogen.
Oh, sorry.
You can't do that. Right? It's funny, but and then
They
people have
both
to,
are needed.
yeah.
Yeah, they're both needed to
Well,
breathe.
because
right?
the model is if the nucleus has a different number of protons, it's a different element. And that's what gives us hydrogen with 1 proton and helium with 2. So if you agree on the premise, you can't be like, well, I don't like helium. Well, the same thinking produces our identification of helium as does hydrogen. You don't get to choose. You have to take the whole damn model because it's all interconnected. But if someone is limited in their ability to see that interconnected way of how everything is connected and every assumption is based on some other paradigmatic assumption, it's this giant spider web. And that's what you and I can do. And if someone can't do that, then they're going to take personal offense or feel like their personal opinion isn't getting respected, when we're just saying, no, A goes to B, A doesn't go to X. You can't do that. Well, I prefer to think of helium having 10.5 protons. Well, no. You can't do that.
There is an objective reality ground to solve these things.
Yeah.
And it's only the insecurity in another person who's offended and projects, you think you know more than me. Wait, look, that would only come out of an insecurity where your own self-sovereignty is not yet deeply established in the heart, that you're triggered that way.
Yeah.
So again, Margie, people who've known me for 20 years, 25 years going on, some of them, they know that I've said more times than I can count that I've lived a life in my own consciousness of adaptive insanity.
Yeah, well said.
And you've heard me say it in a bunch of different ways. I've always had a background of insanity because it really is objectively true that there are paradigms, but no one has had the emoto-philosophical chops to teach what paradigmatic thinking is and how critical it is to a whole life, to a life of wholeness.
Yeah.
So you're not unconsciously slave to unconscious conditioning of paradigms where you're triggered by someone else's paradigm. Because we're passionate, but we've already admitted, Joseph and I both, we've got stuff that will give the flavor. So Margie's reflection helped me rebase how important it is to keep not identifying self-worth by being the founder of the paradigm. That's what I'm working on consciously and actively for 10 years. And since 2015, almost I've had to take that apart, but so you helped me rebase it, and I appreciate the reflection. And this whole podcast shows how complex the whole dynamic is of judgment or reflections to others. It's really tricky.
It is, yeah. And I thank you, Margie, as well. I already thanked you via email. But yeah, for me, just this morning, I was talking with clients, and I'm starting to see that when I'm relating with people, there are these forks in the road that show up where I can go more relational and be with them, or I can go to paradigmatic frameworking, which is interesting but not necessarily relational. And I did a couple of places this morning working with clients where I chose the more relational route versus the more wisdom paradigmatic thinking route, and it's really good, and that's my own day-to-day practice. So it's thank you for the criticism and giving us something to work on, because there's always new. Now, if there's 100 of you who think we're arrogant, please don't send 100 emails. No, I'm joking. If you wanted to, you could. You send us anything, but that would be funny. Like, oh well, I've got some shit to say about you guys too now. I don't know. If you did it with heart, I'm open to it.
Sure.
But it makes me want to say one more thing about this, because it came up recently where I think I've talked about this before. I'll try to make it quick. I live on this dirt road where the county gravel road where the county optionally takes care of it. They're not responsible for doing it. Through various lobbying efforts, we've gotten them to occasionally come and do stuff, and the recent administration has said, we want to take care of the road. We really want to do this right. And we're like, great. Well, we've been taking care of it for like the last 4 years, and we'd like
homeowners.
Homeowners, the neighborhoods, really only 4 or 5 of us. We've been taking care of it, and we'd like to work with you to make sure, so we can tell you what we've been doing, because we were following federal guidelines for how gravel roads should be maintained. And you guys have done some questionable stuff, so can we work together and decide how this goes? Long story short, they put in a few days' work. They made it worse. They scraped the gravel off the road, flattened the crown, and turned important sections where there's some grade, they turned it into mud. They packed down the mud instead of scraping off the top, eliminating the potholes, dumping a bunch more gravel, and then pressing that in with a roller, which is the right way to do it. So they brought in resources, made it worse. And we're like, fuck, what happened? Why didn't you return my calls? Can you guys put some gravel down? Sorry, we're going to think about paving it next year. Like, it's not going to make it through the winter. And so their final comment, almost final, was basically say, we're done with this for now, parentheses, tough luck, but if it gets really bad, we'll come in and repair it. So what I see is that's what caused the Lahaina fires.
Yes, that's right.
That's a paradigm. And the paradigm is you don't fix it until it breaks. And you can see that in any aspect of Hawaii government. Anywhere you look, they're waiting for shit to get bad enough to bother putting work in. And that's what happened with the electrical lines in Lahaina. That's what happened with the water rights issue on the west side. The traffic in Lahaina, with all sorts of things that were not getting addressed and added up to $5 billion worth of damage and 100 people dead. So when I see this, so when someone says, we're done with this for now, but if it gets screwed up, let us know and we'll come work on it. That's where that goes for me. It's spider webs to all of the problems in the world that are caused by, it's not quite bad enough for us to put our attention on it. Let's let it get worse. So that's where it comes from, that I get animated about. It's like, can you not see this? One more example on this, the Hawaii Telecom, there was probably a 400-pound branch leaning against one of our internet lines. And I called them up and they said, oh, thanks for letting us know, we'll take care of it. And my neighbor also called them, and the Hawaii Telecom told them, oh, we'll only deal with that if the line breaks. It's the landowner's responsibility to fix it. So there it is in black and white. We wait until it breaks in order to fix it. So then I had to find out who the landowner was, which was a company, not a person. And then I had to make 6 phone calls to get them to deal with it. Meanwhile, there were like 30 people using internet that could have disappeared at any moment. Why? And it's more expensive to fix when the line breaks. Why wait? There it is. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is a paradigm. And unless Hawaii deals with that, there's all this talk about restitution and changes. If they don't address that one way of doing things, there'll be another Lahaina fire, or it'll be somewhere else. It'll all happen again, and it will be no surprise to someone like me. Oh, man, that makes me so mad. We could be doing so much better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you cover that. Folks, I've driven on this little archaic bridge. If this goes down when a car goes over it, this could threaten a person's life. But as important, it cuts off a whole section of rural Maui.
The bridge is something, that power line, that internet line was right near the bridge. The bridge is something I've been working on too. I got a county engineer to come out and look at it, and he found a date underneath the bridge. He went really looked carefully. It's 120 years old, that bridge. And he's like, I think it's pretty bad. I'm going to call in an engineer from Oahu who's really knows this kind of stuff. And the answer I got was, it's not quite as bad as we thought, and there are worse bridges on the east side of Maui that need attention, so we're going to wait on this one. That was the answer, because there are worse bridges, so we have to prioritize that. I don't know, maybe fix all of them. What about that? It's 120 years old, and it has exposed rusting rebar, which is what caused the collapse of that condo in Florida that killed a bunch of people.
Oh,
Like,
yeah,
is
right.
visible
That's right.
rusting rebar, integrity compromised. No, let's just wait on that. Because why? Because there are worse bridges. That's not critical thinking. It's definitely not paradigmatic thinking. Fuck.
And in my experience, when someone tells me that they were told as a 12-year-old that they're going to hell because they masturbate,
Yeah.
and this child is terrified and lived in this person until they saw me when they were 30, 32, maybe 20 years later, and that active reality is still active in them. Nothing is fixable in the Catholic paradigm because it's all God's word.
Yeah.
You see? So it's the same result why I get animated about the toxicity of both evangelical and Catholic Christianity.
Yeah.
It damages people. And it's the same way that these kinds of things at the municipal level and the state
Yeah.
level
Yeah. It's
damage
everywhere.
people.
Yeah. And,
So,
it just hit me another piece that hits me about this that I'm for sure is the case for me and probably you as well, is I feel over responsible for the world, for human beings. And I've chipped away at that. When Donald Trump was first elected, I found a big chunk of it and sort of got through it. But it's still there. And leaders, by definition, take responsibility that isn't theirs.
yes.
That's what a leader does. They're saying, I'm going to make this my problem. Well, but it's not your problem. I'm making it that.
And right there, paradigmatically, they're on shaky ground. Instead of being responsive, they're over responsible.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's another whole key picture,
Yeah.
key element here to the picture.
And if I didn't feel over responsibility, which my mother trained into me for her emotions, if I didn't have that, would I maybe not have sufficient responsibility in order to want to help the world? Probably not, right? Because she was my world and I felt responsible for her. And it's the same for Tony Robbins, by the way. He had big caretaking issues with his mother, and you can hear it. He talks about it sometimes. So there is some truth to, we need the disease, like we were both talking about having the gift not seen. You have to have the disease in order to become the cure, and that's asymptotic. Absolutely. I don't know if you can ever get rid of it.
No, and there's a beautiful saying from the East that sometimes you take the wrong road to the right destination.
Nice.
Same principle here. You've got to homeopathically have the disease before you can find the self-cure that maybe you can share with others. So yeah, I had the same kind of mother, vampire mother also. They vampired us, and by being trained to take care of their world, we became caretakers of the world, and then we find metaphysics that enlighten how that can be done, and we go crazy. And we're both passionate people. 3 and a 4 enneagrams here. I'm moving to 1, and Joseph is moving. What's 3?
6.
6. Yeah. Okay. So sobriety. Quietude and a healthy certainty, healthy even-handedness.
Well, and 6s, healthy 6s, which I don't know how many that I've met. It's so hard to be a 6, but it's very relational. And that's why that thing I was talking about before about making the the relating more important than the truths is so important.
Absolutely. So we're working on it, Marge. We are.
And everyone else.
And it's really a complex question. So thank you for giving us a really good opportunity to own our own shadow stuff that we're still working on, because no one's ever done an identities paradigm. And again, we would love to have, if we had guests on the show.
We have. We may do it again.
I know. Yeah, a call-in creates a different relationality than the bubble of the podcast. Yeah. So watch us work with real people in pain, and see what we're made of in that domain, as well as in our perhaps over-exuberance here.
And if anyone wants to be a guest, you can email me at josephjosef@clearandopen.com. And there's one more thing I want to say, at least. I'm going to call this podcast, I'm going to title it An Apology for Arrogance. And do you get the irony?
Nice. Oh, it's the double irony.
Yes.
Verbally and energetically.
Yes, because the true meaning of apology comes from the Greek meaning rational explanation for something. The ology is the same as in biology and psychology. And
apologia.
That's right.
Apologia.
Socrates' Apologia,
Yes.
or Plato wrote it, but it was
That's
about
right.
Socrates' speech. It was an explanation. He didn't apologize. In other words,
No,
he
no.
didn't say he was sorry for, quote, corrupting the youth of Athens, which, by the way, was a democratic vote, folks. The father of Western philosophy was democratically executed, so that should be a clue about whether democracy works, because the majority agreed. And he made this famous speech for what he was really doing and why it was okay. That was his Apologia. And so this is our nodding to the green contributions, hopefully in a way that was satisfying for Margie et al. And also the rational explanation. Et al. Meaning anyone else who thinks we're arrogant or perceives the ways in which we are, which is fine. But there is a rational explanation for it. And maybe one day I won't have a strong opinionation about stuff. I definitely have days like that.
Sure, me too.
Yeah, where there's just a lot of peace and
whatever.
And sort of I guess we're all learning, and that happens sometimes too. But put me on a stage and ask me some questions about the state of the world, and this is generally what comes out. So I guess that's how it is.
And it has been an overwhelming, not to offset anything we've been talking about today, but there's an overwhelming positivity that people have in listening to. I've heard people tell me, we love your excitement about stuff. You're both human and transparent, and you get really passionate. So how do you passionately have humor and sorrow and animation in a Emoto's spiritual philosophy? We're treading ground here. We're learning ourselves where the limits are.
Yeah.
So.
I've been listening to Sam Harris recently, who's a very, very smart guy. He's doing that even-keeled kind of very intellectual Buddhist kind of thing, and it's just a really different style, and that's more who he is. I think he's a 5. A 5'6", sure. And so that's more of his intellectualized thing, and he's going to appeal to people who are not off-put by the paradigmatic conflicts that you and I evoke over a drink. That's just how we are. So, and if there are other hedonists who would want to create a podcast that is different, I encourage them to do it, because I know, like we said, I know hedonists who can't listen. People who are well down the path can't bear to listen to us talk. Yeah, I understand. It pinches a bit. Yeah, but I get it. I understand.
It's also perhaps worthy to mention that metaphysics themselves and paradigmatic thinking is much more, not exclusively, but it's much more yogic than it is yin.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And so women and men who have more yin than yang, perhaps, in their being toxic or healthy. There's just a lot of blah, blah, blah. And so we're not saying this is for everyone. You have to have a flavor taste, a hunger for the meeting of the heart, the soul, and the mind. You got to have a hunger for it. Just because you don't doesn't make you bad. Bree doesn't like to listen to these things.
Yeah.
She says, well, why would I listen to it? I hear you talk 24/7.
Right. And like Eric Grace, who I know listens to all of our podcasts, what he does on Clubhouse is really cool, because he's super great at conveying and transporting people to an Emoto spiritual place without going very heady or paradigmatic. He does that too and can do that, but he's really good at making sure the feeling vibe stays heartful and loving, and I totally respect him for doing that. It's just totally different. And if you haven't listened to him on Clubhouse, I invite you to.
Absolutely. And there are so many different kinds of flavors of consciousness out there, mature and immature, and the whole range. We need as many people as possible to offer identity through their viewfinders and their gifts, as long as we're all questioning why we are using our gifts the way we are using them.
Yeah. And thank God Eric is doing what he's doing, because he's another very public voice because if there weren't other voices like his out there, people might think identity is extremely intellectual, which it's not at all. Yeah. But when we get together, it becomes
Sure.
meta, beyond intellectual. This is paradigmatic
Yeah.
stuff. And for some people, that is a important entree into it. Like for me, it was.
Yes.
I was
Yeah.
not. If you had sold to me back when I saw you speak in, what was that, 2003,
Three.
2 or 3,
Three.
you
Yeah.
know, it made sense to me more than I could feel it. And it
Yeah.
was the sense piece that first drew me to do that intro weekend thing. And then I secondarily had feeling experiences. And for some people, that's what they need. For some people, it's the opposite. So there are people who need paradigmatic sense making in order to be drawn. Other people are just like, this is all head
No.
talk. Give
Yeah.
me an experience. So
Yeah. Exactly.
that's harder to make a
Just
podcast of.
it is. Otherwise, you're Oprah. You know.
Yeah. Oh, God.
So
You said so much in just that one sentence. Oh, my
now I
God.
know she pioneered for women of color, and it's fabulous that she did, and a role model for 2, 3 generations. And Oprah, sit
But
down.
yeah, how to communicate
Oh,
emotivity without it becoming
oh,
maudlin, overwrought,
oh,
and
oh.
fake. Which
Yeah,
again is something Eric does really well, because he brings
yeah,
people to that place. He creates a kind of feeling field that is
yeah,
very real, and Oprah could take notes on it. I'd like to see
yeah,
that skit. Oprah taking notes from
yeah.
Eric. Help me make my talk
And
show better. And Eric's like, okay.
I went to her show once. I've said this
Right.
before. I'm not sure on podcasts, and she's this golden beacon of empathy and wisdom and
On the air.
patience.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as the red light on the camera went off, oh, she becomes, well, uh, a dictator, cold, heartless. So
Yeah.
maybe she had. I went to two weeks apart.
Uh-huh.
And that happened in both times. So I can't say it was probably just maybe he had a bad day that day, but you could sense that sweetheart that she is in many ways, and a paradigm buster for talk show hostism, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so
A lot of gifts. I know a carpenter who worked on her place here on Maui, and
uh,
on her, I think the last building, it was something she was having built a 15,000 square foot mansion,
I read about that.
and
Yeah.
and so like the floorboards didn't line up so right, like where the lines were. So at one point, so she had like 2,000. No, it wasn't 2,000. It was like a room, big room, like 800 or 1,000 square foot. A bunch of wood ripped up and had it redone. And the thing that really stuck in my head was that, there's like a dozen workers working all around, and she's there meeting with someone. And it seems to be a really obvious opportunity to go around and shake hands with people so they get to meet Oprah. Didn't talk to any of them.
No.
That really says something. Like, you got the opportunity to make someone's day and go, wow, I
Yeah.
met Oprah. Why wouldn't you do that? That's weird.
Yeah. Well, there's no cameras there. So,
But there was what we call the coconut wireless was there. That's how I found out.
oh God. So, did we just judge Oprah arrogantly?
Mm,
It's a great question, but I hope you saw the squinge that I didn't
yeah.
like doing it, and that what we're talking about doesn't undermine the good things about her at all. It just is another dimension of a complex person,
Mm-hmm.
and so,
And if she were here, we'd be talking about it really differently. We'd go, wow,
very
what
different.
kind of
Yeah,
conditioning, if she was like, people
yeah.
have told me I'm rude and I don't talk to my workers, we would go, well, what happened to you in your childhood that might explain that? And how did your parents treat you? Were they like curious and engaging, or did they mostly just take what they need from you and leave you alone? It would be a
Right.
completely different
We,
thing.
Right. We use the metaphysics in application in a completely different way than in exposition.
Yeah.
And so we're in exposition mode here and friendship mode, and talking like we're talking with someone else who gets oxygen. We breathe the same way, and we get a little animated.
And it
But
could
there's
be,
always room.
yeah, and it could be that next week something happens to both of us and we realize it was all green and this was all a
Yeah.
truth and service. The apologia was just a bunch of crap, and that actually it's possible to heal this entirely. And a soul and expression never comes off as arrogant to anyone, no matter what. I don't know.
I would say I would put ante in all my chips that 100% healed person would have none of this. The question is anyone ever going to be
Yeah.
100%? And can we all just, as long as we're owning our stuff and being self-revealing, can we all just be gentle with each other?
Yeah, and remember, one of the key three principles of identity, which I usually can't remember all three, but I remember this one. Neither can you.
Sometimes I forget too. They're so ingrained.
I know.
Somehow
the shortest list is the one I can never remember.
Yeah.
The self is spiritual of and to itself. So, and then that relates to, which we touched on but didn't quite gel for me. The idea that coming from a universalized consciousness and speaking in a way that maximizes listenability.
Oh, nice.
We have a conditioned idea that that's the highest level of consciousness. That's an anti-fucking human paradigm that says that.
Yes.
That's transcendent.
Yes. Oh, that's so important. That's what the default assumption is.
Yeah.
No, you'd never ruffle anyone's feathers.
Right.
I think Jesus ruffled a few feathers when he started turning over tables in the temple. So where's the line of judgment? Where is it sober and where is it unsober?
Yeah, and how does that connect to, as children, we have to take on a strategy of maximizing approval and minimizing rejection. So then we project. The protector would project that the highest state of consciousness would maximize approval and minimize rejection, would never rub anyone the wrong way. Yes. Like that's the ideal self, has succeeded in that flawed strategy.
Exactly. That's a shrink to fit basis for what's called the ideal.
Yeah.
So let's it actually perfect. We just got a perfect ending here, bud. The three principles, the tripod upon which identity is based, is one is that the self is spiritual of and to itself. It's not in its own nature anti-spiritual. That we are emotional beings before we are willful, mental, and physical, and that we're all responsible, accuser and accusee. We're all responsible for the contents of our unconscious. These are things that have never been put forth with any sort of alacrity or depth of heartfulness as a basis.
And that's not saying it's better than, it's a statement of fact. There are no paradigms that have that as premises. So if that sounded arrogant to you, that's on you. Go study philosophy and look and see if other paradigms are based on that. They're not.
And that's just an objective truth. And you could like it or not like it. It's okay. We're not trying to sell it ever. That made sure of that in the beginning. So anyway,
I do.
Thank you for listening, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
I can sell. Yeah. Thanks so much.
What were you going to say? I can what?
What was I going to say?
I said I do sell it sometimes. I wouldn't say I sell it. I get excited about it, and if people want, I
get excited about it too, and that can be seen as selling.
Sure.
But in my heart, not even at just the level of intention, at deep motive, I decided at the beginning of my weird career as paradigm giver, that I didn't have to sell what felt like applicable universal truths. Either they're receivable in the consciousness of the planet or they're not. So that's why I said to that guy, the Harvard trained VO guy, voice star VD guy, well, you got to decide what you want to do here. I'm not going to go away, but he went away. So
yeah.
Okay. Yay.
By the way, the title of your memoir, if you ever write one, should be My Weird Career as What? With the phrase you just said a minute ago.
Oh,
exclamation point, question mark.
Exclamation, yeah, my weird career as what?
Yeah.
Somebody once asked me recently, why don't you call yourself a prophet? Now, there is an interesting question. Not a spiritual educator, but a prophet. and there's
how much more time you got?
None. I'm done. I'm fried for now. But maybe we can roll that into our non-dual completion.
Yeah, let's start that.
Time.
That's an interesting question because you and I both have the prophet archetype, but
we do.
So why wouldn't you start with that? I mean, yeah, that's an interesting question.
Talk about inciting judgment.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this is so. Yeah, that just came to me 6 seconds ago. So
yeah,
let's see if we can incorporate.
Yeah,
that
and I'm going to go
too.
buy a megaphone and make a sign and go down to the crowded. I don't know how to say that word. Crowdest? What the hell is the word?
Crowdedest.
Is that really the word? Crowdiest?
No.
Crowded? Most crowded. There is no word for that.
Most crowded.
That was weird.
Yeah,
I was sure there was a word and I couldn't get it. I'm going to go to the most crowded part of town and start evangelizing identity with a megaphone. Yes, I am the prophet, a prophet of identity. I'm here to help you. See how that goes. You're all living in delusion. All right, so next time we'll start with why not call ourselves prophets, and then somehow find a segue into, well, because it's Zen, we won't need a segue. It'll just be a new moment, and then we'll finish. Because there are no segues in Zen. There's just a new moment. I just made that up.
That's so true for that paradigm. It's so true.
And then we'll continue our Zen series. I listened to those 2 podcasts. I think the last 2, and I found them so fascinating. So I'm excited to keep going on those.
Yeah, I've got a completion, a third piece to kind of tie up the first 2. So yeah. All right. Till next time.
Thank you, Stace. Thank you, audience members. Thank you for listening. And until next time, wish you well. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. To learn more about Stace Barron and Identity, please visit identity.org. To learn more about Joseph Shapiro, visit clearandopen.com. Until next time, we wish you well on your journey.